We could change the topic. I just think it's
So
that was a healthy discourse.
This here, what he's saying is an indication and an announcement that he has already won this debate. How has he won this debate? Not by effectively arguing against vaccines, because he now has given the appearance that he is a rational person, that there are disagreements, but with him, it's about being understanding and amicable, and that we're both people here. We both have legitimate causes. No! This guy's a fascist. Hello and welcome to my second political commentary. Today we are going to be watching the debate between Charlie Kirk and Vaush on Tim Pool's show. Now, this is a very controversial debate, maybe not so much for what was said, but for who were involved. You have the edgelord himself, Vaush, who loves courting controversy and talking with everybody. And then you have two fascists, Charlie Kirk and Tim Pool, who are very much secretive about their true beliefs, but at the same time dog whistle and go off mask occasionally, just let their supporters know that they truly are white nationalist fascists. So here's the question, really. Should Vaush have platformed these people? Well, not platform, engage with these people, because platforming isn't so much the issue. Having them talk to you is not a problem as long as you make it about their fascism, as long as you make it a confrontation and exposing. If you debate them like you would debate, say, a conservative or someone you just disagree with who has a philosophy that isn't, say, totally anti-democratic and authoritarian, then there is some use to having a cordial back and forth. But with a fascist, your job in a debate is not to counter their arguments, it's to show their true colors in front of everybody. And Vaush failed in this. So how bad is Vaush after all? Vaush says the worst thing imaginable. I'm out of the loop. What happened with Vaush? Let's try this one. Bread tube. Harassing someone? Well, he has admitted that. It was pretty bad, but that was a while ago, and he seems to have changed and grown from that. Oh, here we go. LibReddit. Communism 101. Vaush is bad. Butchering in Marx and Lenin. Dehumanizing trans people by, I don't know. Black people are the same as nationalists when they want to preserve their culture. Okay, it's pretty edgy. He said the N-word when he was talking about the N-word, not at someone or as talking about describing black people. I don't know. These are pretty... Is he a bad guy? He says a lot of great things. He has a lot of great ideas. Now Charlie Kirk. This is about the Capitol, the riots. This historic event will be one of the largest and most consequential in American history. The team at Trump Students in Turning Point Action, Charlie Kirk's thing that he runs, are honored to help make this happen, sending 80-plus buses full of patriots to D.C. to fight for this president. 80-plus buses. So 80-plus buses full of those people, at least a handful or even maybe a majority of which stormed the Capitol. Of course, he deleted this tweet. And then how about Tim Pool, our moderator? Let's look at this. The right-wing militias, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, and just the Proud Boys and the Trump supporters, they're going to rush full speed to D.C. They're going to take the White House to do whatever they can. And paramilitary. A recorded conversation to the Daily Beast. Not even something he didn't think would get out. You could go on and on. Both these people were spreading lies about the election. Both these people say racist things and platform racist people and engage with the propaganda network of Fox News. They legitimize so-called conservative ideas that are really just anti-democratic. They want schools to be censored, to only give the narrative they like. They want voting to be suppressed. They don't want campaign finance reform. They don't want money out of politics. But they'll still talk about corporations and big business as the big boogeyman because they know that that's how they can get to people. One of the things I neglected to mention in the last video was how much the Taliban and the MAGA people have in common. The MAGA people and the Taliban share this desire for a Christian kind of ethnic Muslim sort of idea, this nationalist pride for Afghanistan. And they also rail against the elites of America and the West and say, this is why you need the Taliban. This is why you need MAGA, because we're the only ones in between them and you, even though they're far worse in so many respects than the neoliberals that exist to control us today. Let's look at this. Umberto Eco grew up in fascist Mussolini. He has here a list of 14 aspects of fascism. You know, you don't have to have all of these be fulfilled to be a fascist or to be a proponent of fascism. And every fascism is unique to adapt to its culture, to have the messaging that most resonates with the history of a place. So here we go. Cult of tradition. Tim Pool, Charlie Kirk, all about the Western tradition. A rejection of modernism. The idea that these scientists are not telling us the truth about the vaccines, or the idea that modern sociology is irrational and that education and our college system aren't teaching people knowledge, they're indoctrinating them. The cult of action for action's sake, that's a little tricky. Disagreement is treason. This is very much seen where if you criticize Trump, you are out of MAGA. Fear of difference, of course, immigrants, Muslims, non-Christians, progressives, liberals, communists. Appeal to social frustration. Again, we have so much pain in what is called the heartland and in rural places with opioid epidemic, lack of wage increases relative to inflation. And also this social justice warrior, the idea that Charlie Kirk and Tim Pool perpetuate of this progressive gay agenda or whatever sort of scapegoat they're on at the moment. The obsession with a plot. The deep state is out to get you. The enemy is both strong and weak. You have this idea that liberals and progressives are pansies and they're easily pushed over by big business, but also that Pelosi is this arch evil mastermind and Biden is going to start an authoritarian progressive country, which is, of course, an oxymoron. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. There are some anti-war sentiments, but as soon as Biden does something anti-war, like pull out of Afghanistan, of course, that the war drum gets beaten again. Contempt for the weak. There's a sort of elitist idea of the makers and the takers already in conservatism, but you also see Charlie Kirk literally talks about the muscular class, the doers instead of the takers. This idea that Trump is somehow this strong man, this strength is all that is important. Everyone is educated to become a hero. Again, you are the one that's going to save us. You know, you're the one that's going to find out the real information and spread it and be the leaders of the revolution. You are the one that is going to save us from progressive fascism. Of course, they're doing just fascism, but they don't really seem to notice that. Or if they do, they keep it quiet. Selective populism. You have populism very much pointed at white people, pointed at white rural people, and they speak newspeak. That Fox has been doing this forever. The truthiness Colbert once pointed out, but it's just getting worse and worse and worse. We're going to talk right now whether banning CRT or critical race theory should happen, and the idea that we should censor people and not have them think about racism, not have them think about class. That's what it is. So here we go.
And we can start with one of two things. Obviously, I brought up critical race theory, but also the vaccine issue. I'm not sure if you guys have a preference for what you were...
We talk about the vaccine.
Why don't we talk about what's going on with vaccine passports?
Sure.
We've seen in Sydney, for instance, they issued a lockdown. Enough people ignored it. They went out in the streets, and then this resulted in news articles saying chaos in Sydney. People aren't, they're not following the rules.
So here's an interesting tactic that they're deploying here. They invited them to talk about critical race theory, but they're jumping into something they know Vaush, who is not a scientist, will be challenged by. They're trying to start off putting Vaush off balance. From what I've seen, does a pretty good job of responding, but it is very, very insufficient for if you really want to convince people to take a vaccine.
The vaccination rate in Australia is ridiculously low. I think it's 18%, really, really low. Well, then they called in police, and there were big protests. Now they've actually deployed military. So I'm curious if either of you wants to jump in with your thoughts on mandates. What would happen if they came here, if you're for or against them?
Look, there are elements of mandates that I can agree with. We've already set standards for other things like the MMR vaccine, very basic standard vaccines that we expect everyone to get before they can go to school, travel. And I think for the most part that's worked. We've eradicated plagues from the world. I think we should be proud of that. With regards to COVID, since this is an ongoing pandemic, we need to focus on approaches that are effective and that don't ostracize.
So this happened about 3 weeks ago. I actually wanted to make this my first video. I chose Afghanistan because it was such a pressing issue and so timely. I wanted to have this be my first video because I wanted to talk about debating with fascists. I want to talk about COVID. And I thought critical race theory was important. Now, critical race theory has kind of been dropped as a boogeyman for the right because it just, I guess it ran its course. It got boring. So they've moved on to vaccines and other things. But I still think it's an important thing to talk about. Since this debate happened, COVID has exploded across the country. So there's going to be some things to say about this that they wouldn't have had a chance to know about. But it's also just makes this first part of the debate all the more pressing to discuss.
Or exacerbate tensions. With regard to the Australian situation, it's not something I'm extensively familiar with, but generally speaking, I don't think that cracking down on protests is going to be an effective way to incentivize people to get vaccinated. What's happening in New York might be, but my main issue with it is that I'm not entirely sure how they expect people to still have their vaccination card. I know that there's been some confusion from the beginning as to whether or not you should keep that. I know people have thrown theirs away. They made it too big for wallets. It just felt a little bit haphazardly planned from the...
So the government has records of everyone that's been vaccinated. You can get a new one, I'm sure. That can be solved. I don't know why he's conceding this point. I guess because he just doesn't know that much about the issue because he's not a scientist. This isn't one of his main things that he talks about, and they sprung it on him. It's pretty clever on their part.
Forego. So that's unfortunate. Maybe they can find other ways to incentivize it, like for example in schools where they have a direct access to government records where they wouldn't have to use those little cards. You know, that might be a little bit better. I guess we'll have to see.
Well, I'm not saying you believe this, but some people on the left, I never want to hear about the discussion of voter ID ever again. Because now you can force people to identify their medical history to try to get into a restaurant in New York City. Yeah, look, I'm not getting the vaccine, so I'm part of the 100 million people that are unvaccinated.
The idea of voter fraud isn't the thing. We know that because it doesn't make sense. Why would you steal one vote and risk going to jail? There's no cost-benefit analysis that would make that ever make sense. However, if people are terrified of the vaccine and they want to go places, having a fake vaccine card is a really useful thing for those people. In fact, we've already arrested a bunch of people doing it. We've already arrested people making them. We've already arrested pharmacy people that have basically stolen a bunch of vaccine cards and we're selling them. So this is just ridiculous.
And it's an experimental vaccine. The FDA and CDC has said that in January. It's questionably effective. Lindsey Graham just came down with COVID. You had a vessel, a ship in the United Kingdom, 100%.
Experimental, but we've been working on it for 40 years. So not exactly a new technology. And questionably effective. Even at this time, there was so much about its effectiveness against getting sick from it, getting infected originally, and also the duration of the sickness, the possibility of death, severity of the sickness, the long-term side effects that are less likely to happen.
Vaccinated ship that came down with COVID. It's more like a treatment than a vaccine. I'll leave that conversation to Dr. Brett Weinstein and the people that really understand.
Brett Weinstein took ivermectin on camera. This guy is not a real doctor. He's a freaking quack charlatan.
How that works. But yeah, this is medical apartheid. This is trying to create a two-tiered system where if you don't make the proper medical decisions, you're not able to go to Broadway shows or go into restaurants.
Comparing this to racial oppression is so offensive.
Even when the efficacy of this vaccine is questionable at best. We see that in Israel, an 85% vaccinated country that's about to lock down again.
Not 85% vaccinated. The total population is a little over 50%. Because so many people couldn't get it, because the population is very young in Israel, the effective vaccination of the people who can get it is more close to 85%. I don't know where he's getting that number. It's more in the high 70s.
And most of the new cases are from vaccinated patients, not unvaccinated patients in Israel. So, sorry, you want to interject him? But
Yeah.
obviously against mandates, and I think people should be able to make their own medical decisions. I think it's pretty obvious.
This is just not true.
Well, I disagree. I think we actually have a story on timcast.com that our view of the lockdowns is that it's alarmism because a new study from the Public Health of England found the Pfizer vaccine is 96% effective after 2 doses at staving off the Delta variant, and AstraZeneca was 92%.
I could probably agree it's alarmism, but it's enough of an alarm for the public health leaders to undermine the argument that the vaccine is a solution to what would possibly.
He literally agrees it's alarmism. Alarmism means sounding the alarm when it's not warranted.
Satisfy the public.
So-
I mean, I was against the lockdowns in the first place. Let me be very clear when there was 1,000 deaths a day, not 334. But sorry, go ahead.
Well, a couple of points on this. First of all, it's experimental in the sense that there was an expedited process for its release, but there have been full and extensive studies taken on the safety and effectiveness of these vaccines.
True.
The reason why the FDA study hasn't been finished, the reason why it hasn't been fully vetted, isn't because they're looking for long-term health effects, it's because they're determining the extent to which it protects you over a long period of time. Ergo, the fact of the matter is, by all available data, this is undeniably much safer to get the vaccine. I mean, by orders of magnitude.
Let me ask you a question.
Well, wait, a couple.
Of course, now the Pfizer has been approved by the FDA.
You said a few things there. There are some instances where areas have more people being infected if they're already vaccinated. But if you take a look at, this is like data mining. If you take a look at the broader statistics, especially here in America, the number of people who have gotten breakthrough cases is something like 0.003% of people who have been vaccinated. You can take a look at the numbers. Where is this new wave exploding? It's in the unvaccinated. In spite of the fact that fewer and fewer people are remaining unvaccinated, the vaccinated stay relatively healthy. And not only do they get infected way less often, they also suffer far fewer severe symptoms. Their hospitalization rates have plummeted, and their deaths are incredibly low compared.
And lowering the hospitalization rates means you can keep hospital beds open so that when people get sick or injured, they can go to the hospital, as opposed to when you have huge amounts of unvaccinated people taking up hospital beds.
To people who are unvaccinated. This is by all means an effective vaccine.
What's your opinion of Johnson & Johnson, the FDA saying that it might cause a rare nerve disease?
That's something that, first of all, when you take a look at that, you have to recognize
Always just asking questions.
that even if that was the case,
Which the FDA says it is.
right? Well, they're looking into it, of course. It does seem-
So rare.
Issued an official warning that it could issue a rare nerve disease. That's a big deal.
could issue, of course. They're looking into it, and that is something to look into and to be concerned about.
What's your opinion of VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System?
hold on.
Where
Let's-
there's
let's-
over-
well, first-
I'm just curious because
Let's do the Guillain-Barré syndrome,
Yeah.
though. I think you want
Yeah,
to.
so of course, stuff like that can happen. Now, even if that claim is the case, it would remain the fact that unless the extent of that potential.
So here he's using a common fascist tactic of asking so many questions and also asking questions that he knows the person he's talking to doesn't have definite answers to try to make them seem like they're the irrational ones and he's the one posing the real questions.
Potential nerve damage is just apocalyptically severe, that the effects of getting COVID would still be far, far worse than the potential side effects of that vaccine. However, if you were to say, let's say worst case, Johnson & Johnson, it's not viable, that gets pulled, we see what the consequences are, that doesn't really speak against the greater viability of the vaccines. I got Pfizer, for example. We're talking hundreds of millions of people who have either been protected against the vaccine in part, or if they get it, against the virus, or if they get it, their effects, their symptoms are much, much, much more manageable.
So I just want to play into the irony here that I'm the one criticizing the pharmaceutical companies and you're the one defending. I just think that's I think it's delicious.
Wait,
to be
hold
honest,
on. That's an
because-
extremely dishonest talking point.
Well,
But
you're
I'm
you're peddling the
praising-
Pfizer vaccine. You're saying
not-
it's so effective. So many
wait,
people
hold on,
have taken
hold on,
it.
wait.
And I'm the one saying, hold on, maybe AstraZeneca, Moderna,
Charlie.
Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer.
This is
Let's talk about the points he's made. And
No, I was just enjoying the irony.
well,
That's
it's
all.
This is making it seem like the only people involved in this vaccine are the executives at Pfizer, Moderna, etc. That's just not how it works. There have been so many researchers in so many different places that have made this vaccine possible that the idea that somehow Pfizer and Moderna would be able to manipulate all these people who have dedicated their lives to knowledge to make something that is harmful to people as opposed to helpful is just a conspiracy theory, but it's such a dangerous one because it instills distrust in experts, another aspect of fascism. It instills distrust not in pharmaceutical companies, who we have to talk about in this issue, but distrust in our scientists and our doctors, and instead we're supposed to trust Charlie Kirk. That's the real thing that's going on here. And I don't think Vaush really addresses it.
Well, the thing is, it's not really like irony if you understand the issue at hand. See, my praise doesn't go to the pharmaceutical companies or their CEOs. It goes to the tireless workers who spent months and months and months developing these vaccines. I'm very
Who's getting
mind.
rich
big
from
fan.
this vaccine?
Well, hold on. Have I at any point praised the distribution or profiteering system?
Who do you think
behind
gets rich
Pfizer?
from vaccine
So
mandates?
This is,
The
so
workers or
this
the-
is
So here's the thing. I think Pfizer and Moderna need to release their patents. The way mRNA vaccines work is you can send them literally the code for the sequence of mRNA, and they can synthesize the mRNA and the lipid nanoparticle, and they can make a vaccine anywhere. You just need the equipment, instructions, and the code. And they could lift the patents, and we could get the world vaccinated in months.
Pfizer CEO.
Nobody's talking about who gets rich. This is a toothless.
Isn't that your whole
Wait, hold on.
shtick?
This is a
Like,
toothless
workers'
critique that you
rights.
could.
Let's
Hold on.
try and go back and forth.
This is a toothless critique that you could apply to literally anything that you don't like. Everything in this country is manufactured to the profit
No,
of
but
CEOs.
we don't mandate it, and so you can't go to restaurants if you don't get one of
Yeah,
four
so-
major
but if you're-
pharmaceutical
so let me-
medicines.
Wait, I just want to say, if that's your criticism,
That's one
then,
of many.
Then you should. So if that's the criticism you want to focus on, I'm in favor of nationalizing the pharmaceutical industry. I'm willing.
This is just something that would be very difficult to do when it would be very easy to force them to release the patents and then get the ball rolling that way.
To take it that far. But whether or not that's on the table, and I can't just make that happen, when we're talking strictly about the effectiveness of the vaccine, it seems to be effective.
let's
That's not a praise of the capitalist industry behind
No,
it.
I was just enjoying the irony. That's
It's
all.
not irony,
Well, it's
Charlie.
totally ironic because I'm the one saying that they might be lying to us, and you're the one that's saying it's super effective.
Wait, what
Which
lie?
usually, if we were wearing our traditional uniforms, right versus left, it would be the other way around. That's all I'm saying.
The only comment
But
I'm making
what,
is
what do you
as
have to
the
say about
effectiveness
VAERS,
of
though?
the
What do you have to
vaccine.
say about the vaccine adverse?
So I would say that if these people were actually in good faith and recognized that the vaccine was developed by people who care and is supported by people who care and who are experts, who understand how it works, understand the data we're getting from it. But there are some questions about the vaccine. One, did they know that it wouldn't have that long of an effect? Did they know about the booster need before we found out about it? And also, did they anticipate a Delta variant? Did they anticipate variants? Did they not tell us about that? That they would then need to make a vaccine for every variant, and then that would mean more vaccines for them to sell. There are questions to ask of the pharmaceutical companies, but none of those questions are, is the vaccine safe and effective?
Event reporting system that says, well, over 7,000 people experienced death after getting the vaccine. Does that worry you?
The VAERS system is entirely self-reported. I don't think it's generally used
Do you think
to
it's
form accurate
underreported
metric.
or overreported?
With VAERS, it's almost impossible to say. You know what VAERS is, right? Can you tell me what VAERS is?
Yeah, VAERS is a government.
Why doesn't he say it's overreported? Because we have actual data showing that this vaccine has very moderate side effects when there are side effects, and just is not killing people, is not causing lasting damage, is a very safe and effective vaccine. And these are VAERS reports, and they're self-reported. If there was a huge conspiracy theory movement that cotton candy was giving you seizures or killing you, there'd be thousands of people claiming on VAERS that cotton candy killed their grandma. So that's what's happening here. The idea that we spread all this misinformation that it will kill you, and then you have deaths attributed to that or injuries attributed to that aren't actually that. And we have doctors and scientists looking over the data and seeing that these are not legitimate claims. Then there's nothing here. There's no there. But he's just asking questions.
Website that physicians or individuals can submit complaints or concerns after an adverse event report from a vaccine, since you cannot win in court against a vaccine production company.
From a vaccine. Again, it's a report after getting a vaccine. After getting a vaccine, the idea that you can then say from a vaccine is false. He's just using squirrely language.
Then they go through some process where the government then can distribute some form of remedy if you had an adverse event reaction.
Right.
That's what VAERS is.
And researchers like it because if you take a vaccine or you get some other procedure, any medical drug done, you can report the effects there, and it can be a way of gathering sort of aggregate data concerning the effects of these potential treatments. The problem is researchers don't use this as a bulletproof way of determining the outcome or effect of anything because they're literally just unvetted online submissions that anybody can put in.
So I
I
agree.
ask you because I want to know, how do you arrive at the conclusion that how many people did you say
Well,
applied?
it's VAERS' own data is 7,000 plus, and most of which, by the way,
That anyone can submit.
No,
I'm asking
by the
how
way,
you
most of
arrive-
which are physicians submitted. Just so you know, these
the
are
total number.
most of the submissions on the VAERS website are done by like family doctors or local physicians. So I'm just asking what.
He's saying in general it's mostly physicians, but he never said in this case that it was mostly physicians. And even then, of all the hundreds of thousands of doctors, there are going to be some that buy into this conspiracy theory because they don't understand science that well, even though they have an MD degree.
Number of adverse event reactions, would you say maybe there's something wrong?
But I'm asking,
10,000 deaths.
How do you know these deaths were caused by
20,000
vaccines?
deaths? No, I'm just saying that's what VAERS says, right?
No, wait, but so I need to know this.
We
because
don't.
You can, so
That's the
VAERS
question.
So wait, is these just people who have died after taking the vaccine? Like they may have died from some medical incident afterwards, and it just gets put up
This
there.
is
and we're
the
saying
question.
because of the
Usually, a
vaccine?
vaccine gets pulled when you have 15 attributable deaths. We have 7,000 that we have to go through. The question is, when you call time out
Wait,
and say maybe we should
You're not answering the
mandate
question.
it.
How do you know that they're from the vaccine?
We don't. That's the point.
Oh,
but you
okay.
don't either. But the position is let's mandate experimental medicine when we don't know actually what's
Well,
happening.
if you don't know, then
We have so much data. We have hundreds of millions of people who have gotten the COVID vaccine. Self-reported data in a freaking climate of fear and conspiracy is not valid. He's just asking questions, though.
how can you say that medical doctors are the one uploading this information?
no,
Is there
because
any methodology you're
we
looking at
we
to
do
determine
know
these
who's
deaths were
actually
from it?
uploading it. We know that. We know the entries are usually
the
and
claims
typically
being made?
traditionally. How about menstrual cycle disruption, loss of nerve capacity, unable to walk, paralysis, miscarriages, mood changes? Also, you can go through the VAERS database like, oh, that's interesting.
Mood changes. But are we, what about
All things that happen pretty regularly to a lot of people and could be associated with the shot they had the other day because people are being lied to.
the death?
Let me interject
Death
something
is
real quick.
7,000 plus. That's a serious
I
number.
wanna-
How do they know it's from the vaccine? I keep asking you this. You don't
Let me
have an answer.
address 2 points, one from each of you, real quick, so we can try and. How do we know it's from the vaccine? It's a difficult question. I would say that if you have a mass vaccination program which gives out 330 million doses or so, and then people start saying, "Hey, I got the vaccine, then this happened," VAERS isn't here to say it is or isn't. They're here to say, "Can we find a pattern in this?" And I think 7,000 suggests there may be one at the very least. I'm not a scientist, so I can't stress that. I will also say, however, to Charlie, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, it's a side
I
effect.
always mispronounce it.
Guillain-Barré.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, something like that.
My understanding is actually a side effect of many vaccines.
Yeah, it is.
And so
Totally, that's correct. It could be.
well, so the issue I have is one of the things that Vaush brought up is that there's been, how many you mentioned, 100 million, 160 million?
In the
115, I think it is, million.
who have been fully vaccinated?
Fully vaccinated.
I think in that ballpark.
It is so funny to see
So, of course,
Tim
you know-
Pool try to be this calm, I'm the moderator. When you watch him on his show and he's spewing lies and racist bile and craziness.
If you have something very different from any other vaccination we normally do because
Yeah.
we're not having everyone do it all at once.
Yeah, and so this is a mass inoculation thing. And so here's why the American system should answer this question easily. When you have any sort of uncertainty or disagreement, yield to rights.
So
Yield to rights. Allow
Well,
people to
so-
say no. Let me just build out the argument, right? So for me, for example,
So if there's a 0.1% chance that this is a bad thing or hurting people, we should just yield to rights, even though there's a 99% chance that COVID is going to cause a lot of people to die and be maimed, basically, if we don't get these vaccine mandates out there. And no, I'm not for forcing people to get a vaccine. That is wrong. But if your workplace needs you to get a vaccine, it is not your right to not get it. If a restaurant doesn't want unvaccinated people to come in, it is not your right to enter that restaurant, period. That's how it's been in America since the very beginning, and we had smallpox vaccines. This is a disease that is spread by someone breathing in your general vicinity. This is not AIDS, where you have to have sex or share a needle. This is not the common cold, where you can get it off touching the same railing. This is a very infectious, very dangerous communicable disease that is a global pandemic causing mass suffering and chaos.
I'm 27. I don't consider COVID to be a largely disproportionate risk to my way of life. I don't know about this vaccine. I have gotten other vaccines in my life. So I want to be able to have the right to say no to that.
The Delta variant is affecting a lot of young people. Apparently 36% of the COVID cases in Tennessee right now are children. So sorry, Kirk, you're now in the danger zone.
So the American system, Constitution, kind of like the tradition, is to be able to have people have nuance, preferences, and individualism when it comes to these sort of complex issues, not saying you can't go to a restaurant because we want you to take experimental medicine.
Right. So a couple of points on.
Every vaccine in history, or at least many, many times in history, vaccines have been experimental. The smallpox vaccine, which George Washington had mandates for in his army. The polio vaccine was a new vaccine, but people got it and we got rid of it as a problem. The idea that because it's new, we shouldn't take it. If people had had that idea back before this Facebook craziness of conspiracy theories spreading, they had it with polio, we'd still have polio. They had it with smallpox, we still have smallpox. So many infectious diseases. And these were all new vaccines because, of course, they were new vaccines. They'd just been invented.
On that. First of all, if we're speaking to legal rights, the Supreme Court found over a century ago that when it came to vaccinations, this was a special exemption from some people's rights to.
I will
determine
agree
their
with you
medical
that the
history.
courts
It's like
are not on my side.
1904 in that one. And there's a reason why. Because, of course, when you choose not to take the vaccine, you contribute to the removal of others' freedoms. See, it's true. You do have a freedom to not or to take a vaccine. But I think other people should have the freedom to not grow up in a world ridden by plague. And with the way this disease, COVID, mutates with time, as all diseases do, inevitably, if it continues to circle the world long enough, and this is an international problem, not just an American one, new strains will develop, which will slowly ebb at the effectiveness of this set of vaccines. So,
Which is why we must release the patents to get the world vaccinated, because if there are unvaccinated people anywhere, we're going to see new strains.
threatens all of us. May I say one other
Yeah,
thing?
yeah,
Sorry. With all of that being said, just to speak to VARS, VARS is an incredibly effective system for locating and roughly attributing concerns related to the effects of drugs. The problem is that there are several elements to this disease that make it really difficult to pinpoint anything specific. The two of which being A, hundreds of millions of people vaccinated. That is a huge range to pull data from. And B, the propagandist fear campaign about an incredibly effective vaccine process that may lead people to misattribute
I just want to
deaths
get a
that they
clarification.
experience to vaccine.
Thank you. I love how Charlie Kirk starts talking over him when the most obvious argument that proves Charlie Kirk is full of BS is brought up.
Sorry.
But just quick clarification. Are you for mandating the COVID-19 vaccine?
The same way we have other vaccines, like school, travel, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
So, like, what if someone wanted to go to a restaurant or a supermarket or a movie theater?
I think that, we don't have that for other vaccines, right? Like every time you go to a movie theater, you have a little card. I understand that might be an effective panic measure, but long term, my goal would be to integrate it into the same revenue of vaccines.
I think that's a more reasonable response than some politicians. I'm just going to be honest.
People are panicking.
No, I think that's a more,
people die.
well, yeah.
I just want to make sure we
Right.
weren't having, like, misunderstanding.
No, I
over
think that's
whether-
more of a reasonable answer. I just curious, just on the vaccine topic in general. Are you concerned by like Dr. Malone coming out, who literally invented the mRNA vaccine and says that there's a
Dr. Malone's not the inventor of the mRNA vaccine. The inventor was actually a woman, but it's kind of weird to say inventor because there were many different things that have led to the mRNA vaccine by many different researchers in many different places that have led to this wonderful miracle medicine. Oh, again, it is a vaccine, not a medicine. A medicine is a drug that helps you. A vaccine is a piece of the virus which activates your immune system. The mRNA includes a piece of the virus, hence it is a vaccine. Duh.
the dangerous spike protein involved, and he encourages people to think twice before getting it. Does that move you at all?
Well, you're free to speak with your doctor when it comes to
No, Dr. Malone, just his specific commentary.
specific
the guy who
The one guy I have who agrees with me.
invented this type
Right.
of
Well,
vaccine.
I'm not a PhD, and I doubt that he was directly involved in the production of these
No,
vaccines.
he literally invented this
the
type of
mRNA,
vaccine.
but with the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer, the.
But he's very, very aware of the sort of accelerated implementation. He's trying to call time out and tell people this is not like any other vaccine.
What
Does
is
that
his
worry
claim?
you? His claim is that it involves a spike protein. It was rushed to market. It's going to have side effects. You don't understand it like I did. I invented this, and you got
A spike protein. Like, he just says that as if obviously that's bad. The spike proteins produced by the mRNA vaccine, well, it's produced by your body. Ribosomes make the protein. This might be a good idea to go through this now. How mRNA vaccines work. Either there's a lot, way too complex things going on, or it's way too simplified, or there's one part missing here but a different part missing here. So I did find this one. Now, here are the spike proteins. We have the mRNA code, which is the viral mRNA that produces the spike proteins on the virus, and a lipid nanoparticle, which is just a small thing of fat, which then membrane is made of lipids, so that allows it to go into the human cell by being taken in because of the lipid nanolayer, and this puts the mRNA in the human cell. It never goes into the nucleus where the DNA is, so it never can change the DNA, but the ribosomes do start making the spikes. This is how the virus gets into. It attaches and then it inserts its mRNA into the cell. So we make just the spikes off the virus, and then that has an antibody response. where B cells, they don't have that here, are made that produce these antibodies, and then the antibodies hook into the virus if it's present, and the lymphocyte, or they call them white blood cells if they're in the bloodstream, comes and consumes the virus. Also, the lipids are just used and absorbed by your body. The mRNA is attacked by the immune system and is gone within 3 days, as are the spike proteins. And all that is left are the B cells, which aren't here, unfortunately. Again, I haven't been able to find a good drawing. If someone wants to help me make a really simple explanation drawing of how this works, who has better graphical design skills than me, that would be very, very awesome. So here we go. We have the spike proteins, and then they're gone from our system as the mRNA. None of them are there. There's no shedding of spike proteins. They're perfectly harmless. They are only the thing in the virus that gets the mRNA into the cell. They have no other harm whatsoever, and they're gone from the body within 3 days. So then you have the B cells that remember the spike proteins. So as soon as the virus comes, recognizes the spike proteins, puts antibodies on the spike proteins. This does two things. The spikes can no longer invade the cell. The antibodies deactivate its ability to insert the mRNA into the cell. And then, of course, lymphocytes come and eat all the virus, and you never get sick. Well, that was with the original COVID. But the Delta variant, there's slightly different mRNA for these spikes. So they aren't as effective at stopping it in its tracks, though it is still very, very effective.
Got to think twice before mandating it or even taking it if you're under a certain age. Does that bother you?
What makes the current retinue of vaccines that we take, the mRNA process, different from other mRNA
It doesn't involve the
vaccines?
spike protein. According to him, the same composition as like the measles, mumps, rubella type vaccine or the chickenpox vaccine.
Well, those weren't mRNA. The process wasn't developed back.
Original vaccines take years to make. A new mRNA vaccine could take months, maybe, if you have a good starting point. mRNA vaccines have salt, sugars, the lipid nanoparticle, and the mRNA strand. That is it. These so-called traditional vaccines have all sorts of weird things to get the deactivated cell into the body. There's all sorts of weird chemicals that you have to use to get the deactivated virus in the body. And it's often grown in like egg albumin or something disgusting like that, as opposed to mRNA.
This wasn't developed back during the MMR vaccine.
Totally. Some of them are getting updated for the more mRNA type technology,
If
right?
he wasn't involved in the production of these modern vaccines, how could he possibly have any comment on any of the rigors or tests that were done
Because he
beforehand?
invented this type of vaccine. I'm just saying, does that bother you? Do you think he's just like a fear propagandist and like...
No, he may well have concerns, but those are concerns that I would rather have addressed by the scientific community rather than, with respect to you and myself, YouTubers.
Well, no, I agree. So, but the question is which scientists, right? So there's a lot of scientists.
So I guess I'm lucky on this issue in the regard that I studied biology and physics in college. Currently finishing up as a digital cinema major because I've bounced around a lot in the 15 some years I've been going to college on and off. But I was first a physics major and then a bio major. So I have some understanding of what's going on with the immune system, which is very, very complicated, by the way. The most complicated system in the human body is, of course, the brain nervous system. But the second most is the immune system, because it's a very tricky task to be able to deliver antibodies and white blood cells and lymphocytes to every cell in the body that needs protecting. It's a very complex, attuned system. But the lucky thing is this vaccine itself is a very streamlined, intuitive way to create antibody response. And it really disappoints me that they haven't done more to try to explain how the vaccine works. Maybe they're afraid of the science freaking people out, but a huge reason we have so much anti-vaccination is because of our education system, which has been eroded by mostly Republicans, and people don't have a basic understanding of science. They don't know that a cell membrane is made of lipids. They don't know that the DNA is in the nucleus. They don't know the basic things about how our body works. And that's causing people to be very afraid of these things that they have no basic understanding of.
speaking out against this. Dr. Brett Weinstein, Dr. Malone.
What
right?
is Dr. Brett Weinstein's
He's an
specialty?
evolutionary biologist, so he knows a little bit about how
That's not virology.
cellular function
No,
works.
that is not virology. That is a completely spurious
So let me
association.
do you trust Fauci more or Dr. Brett Weinstein?
It's not about Fauci. It's about Fauci.
He's a virologist.
Fauci has been working on infectious diseases and studying them and directing research on them for decades upon decades. He's a massively important expert, and one reason why the government has been doing a good job on COVID. This is absurd. And as opposed to Dr. Brett Weinstein, who's a charlatan, intellectual dark web or whatever, so it's a ridiculous name. There's no comparison. And then he's trying to equate these two people?
Who's been wrong about everything.
It's about the global. Well, hold on. He's smiling with glee here. It's the global medical community in this regard.
You mean like the WHO? Like
no, not. Hold on. Wait,
put a name behind it.
He's very excited.
Let's.
I just want to say it's not just about the WHO. We're talking about a unified effort on the part of virtually every country on Earth to get a hold of the vaccines that us Americans are privileged to have. This isn't some like pharmaceutical Dr. Fauci push that wasn't broadly supported by any of the relevant experts in the mRNA field, which is not huge because it's a very new development. Internationally, there is a demand for these vaccines.
I wanted to add, just based on what you had said, I can pull up Reuters. Their fact check is that vaccines are not, quote, cytotoxic. They go on to mention that Robert Malone, and they show the Brett Weinstein podcast, they show the post, the FDA was alerted months ago that the spike protein in the COVID vaccines are cytotoxic, toxic to cells. The FDA did nothing. Reuters says this is not true. Now, the issue at hand is trust. Like you mentioned, you said, do you trust Fauci or Weinstein? I don't know if there is a fact-based argument if you have the doctors you trust and the doctors you trust or the organizations you trust.
You have 99% of doctors and organizations and experts, and you have people like Brett Weinstein or this other guy they can mention, and that's it. It's absurd. This is Tim Pool's trying to be so fair and balanced here, but he's doing nothing but perpetuate misinformation.
Clash of who you believe, to be honest.
None of us have the credentials to just come up with these arguments on their own. There will always be bias in who we choose to believe. However, given the plurality of people seem to support the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine, and the fact that it doesn't take a virologist to notice that over 500,000 Americans have died of COVID, more than the combined death tolls of every war since World War I combined, including the Second World War in Vietnam, those are things that I don't need to be a virologist to see.
Can I
see it
ask you a question,
That's
though?
pretty bad.
One of the issues that's brought up frequently, especially on Twitter, is that many of these COVID deaths are died with COVID, as it's brought up, where people would say something like it tends to be people who are over 70 or things like that. I'm only bringing that up not to make the argument, but because you said, how would VAERS know if these are actually related to the vaccine?
I'd love to respond to that if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
So COVID rarely, directly kills you. Like age, it causes a breakdown in other vital functions that then their death can be attributed to such. So, for example, of the many things that people die, it's not really COVID, it's just that COVID blanks their entire system internally, and eventually something fails, something breaks, and they die.
It's not necessarily true. I mean, you could describe any disease as that, I guess. But yeah, COVID kills you. Vaush is out of his depth here.
There were people claiming that there were deaths being spuriously attributed to COVID-19 very early on in this pandemic, but thankfully we know that's not the case, because if you take a look at the excess mortality numbers, the number of people who should die every year in the United States, because there's a very normal pattern, normally with this many people in this country, we see an excess, starting when COVID started, that almost perfectly graphs on to the rising death waves of COVID. I mean, it perfectly tracks onto that.
I just want to say for you, Charlie, I think, the issue I see here is, for me, I can't trust or distrust. I don't know. I think Brett Weinstein's a very smart guy, and I don't think he's going to lie to me. And these doctors are very smart people. Then I see the government agencies that,
I think he's lied to you a lot, but I guess you guys tell a lot of the same lies, so.
I don't always trust the government, to be completely honest. I'm not a big fan. But to believe that there's like a nefarious effort or anything like that, ultimately what it comes down to is, in my opinion, having a trusted medical professional that you can consult with.
Well, I totally agree. And I think there could be an argument that if you're over the age of 70, that this vaccine might be a really good idea for you.
Over the age of 70? Oh my God, where does he get these numbers and ideas? I have no idea.
Or anything like that. Ultimately, what it comes down to is, in my opinion, having a trusted medical professional that you can consult with.
Well, I totally agree. And I think there could be an argument.
So then you probably should agree, in my opinion, that we have socialized medicine, because one of the huge problems here is, with no understanding of science, with very little education about it, if people can't ask the questions and address the concerns with a doctor because they don't have medical insurance or they're underinsured, that's a huge problem. So if you think everyone needs to talk to a doctor to get this vaccine in them before they do it, you should be for socialized medicine. But they're not.
That if you're over the age of 70, that this vaccine might be a really good idea for you. However, to mandate it for schools and for colleges, when these are highly complex medical decisions, that's where I'm going to push back against it.
Well, real
rather
quick,
than
let me
complex.
point
They are
out, though.
complex
The
medical
Johnson & Johnson vaccine is not an mRNA vaccine, though. Is that's my understanding?
I don't want to speak out of turn.
I believe so.
Yeah,
I would
think
love to be
that's right.
fact checked on that.
I'm not
It's also much less effective.
totally sure.
My memory's
So
faulty.
I guess another question I have: what do you think of alternative type treatments, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin? Why the push for mass inoculation?
Well, because
Ivermectin is a dewormer for sheep.
well, hydroxychloroquine studies have found it largely ineffective. There was, I believe, a French study that stopped when people started dying of heart failure. I think the only reason the right dies in this hill is because Trump mentioned it. I don't think there'd be a push for it otherwise. The vaccines are the effective way of getting mass populations inoculated. And while it is true that most of the people who die are ancient, the fact remains that people experience long-term side effects from getting COVID, even if they survive. I know people who are in their 30s, and me, a blistering 27-year-old myself, I'm not especially worried, but I've heard them talk about how much harder it is for them to climb up flights of stairs. I know that erectile dysfunction, fellas, is one of the listed potential side effects of getting COVID. Even young, healthy, no other problems. It is true that death is most comorbid.
The Delta variant has changed everything. We're seeing children, we're seeing younger people get infected, and we're seeing something like 5 times the infectious rate. More deaths with people who aren't vaccinated, more complications, longer illnesses. It's gotten so much worse since when they talked about this.
With age and pre-existing conditions, but still, and that's not even to speak of the COVID variants. I mean, right now you were on Delta, but if it keeps cycling around the world, let it go for another year. Who knows how bad this could get?
So Johnson & Johnson is not an mRNA vaccine. So there's an alternative to mRNA if you're concerned about it.
And there was some guidance with the nerve disease with that. Sorry to interrupt.
I do think
AstraZeneca
we kind of
also.
overlooked something really interesting is that when did we mandate vaccinations in public schools?
Well, I know the Supreme Court case concerning this was in 1904,
Yeah.
so I would know it would have to have been earlier than that. I know that Washington even had his troops vaccinated, though. I
For
forget.
smallpox.
Yeah.
Smallpox, was it?
Yeah.
Which is pretty crazy to think
Inoculated, not vac. Yeah, you're right.
about. Well, I don't know what they did, hit people with a rock and then
It was
pour
like
liquid
a
in.
needle, I think.
It was-
and they would prick you with a needle that had like a weakened sample or something.
And they would have had to forge that needle, like with a blacksmith. Isn't that crazy to think about? Like Washington's,
I know, like someone poured.
I love how Charlie Kirk knows about the history of vaccinations to the point that he knew George Washington made his troops do it. Yet he argues earlier that this is not historical. This is not historically what we do. This is just a new thing and America's changing.
pouring it, and then
Yeah.
today it's just a machine that makes it.
it's just wild to think about.
Well, so, man, I think the real issue for the most part is just mandatory.
Well, I just also have another question. Do you think that there might be any bad motives behind these 4 companies, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, considering they are big pharma and they pursue profits, which generally, as a libertarian socialist, you're skeptical of? Do you think maybe they might have nefarious motives?
Oh, their intentions are reprehensible. They have for many years made money off the backs of American deaths. The opioid crisis is almost entirely attributable to the
And the
malfeasance.
Sackler family.
Yeah, I mean, no moral love for these companies. If this could be, and by the way, the mRNA process was developed through public funding. It was, an effort invested in by the collective good, something I'm generally supportive of. When
The reason why pharmaceutical companies are a problem is not because they make bad medicine, because they have the best researchers and the best doctors working on it. It's because they make that medicine very expensive. They milk people of all their money because they know they need the medicine. That's the nefarious part. Not that the vaccines don't work, but that they're not releasing the patent.
When it comes to these companies themselves, and when I say, go get your Pfizer vaccine, whatever, please do not mistake this or anything else that I say for an endorsement of the practices of these companies. It is only through cruel twist of fate and the economic system we live in that they are the ones put in a position to handle this. But it was the workers at those companies, not the CEOs, who did the work.
I'm just curious, does that ever make you stop short and say, maybe they're trying to massively inoculate us on a vaccine that might not be as effective to try to pursue profit, not well-being? Does that ever enter into your
It's a
calculation?
It's a consideration you should take about anything produced by any company that's run for profit, which is everything. Basically every need in American society is tempered by the knowledge that there are people out there who are paid very large salaries to sell it to you. This is the case for everything we do, everything we eat. Every time you run down Main Street, or in my case, I guess, the boulevards in Los Angeles, you're seeing the protracted efforts of $1 billion industry to make sure you want things they're selling. Could that be the case for COVID? Undeniably, there was a profit incentive involved. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. And there was probably a protracted effort on the part of these companies to make sure they were the first, and they probably took every dirty advantage they could
What
get.
if
But with the data available, I have to still, much as I would say, hey, I would prefer eating McDonald's food to starvation, I have to say this is probably still something we should be doing.
Do you want to do? I don't want to stay. It's been 20 minutes.
No,
so
for
do you
sure.
wanna- do you want to make a final point?
Maybe you would starve instead
I
of
actually
McDonald's,
think
I
this
don't
has been really constructive and not like that, inflammatory. I think that deep down you have this kind of, urge that I'm already there, where maybe they want this thing to go on for another decade to go make another $100 billion. And maybe the cheap drug of hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin might work better than they might think.
I don't have that urge.
Other studies would disagree with you earlier. We could change the topic. I just think it's
So
that was a healthy discourse.
This here, what he's saying is an indication and an announcement that he has already won this debate. How has he won this debate? Not by effectively arguing against vaccines or vaccine mandates. He did not. He got utterly owned. But because he now has given the appearance that he is a rational person, that there are disagreements, but with him, it's about being understanding and amicable, and that we're both people here. We both have legitimate causes. No! This guy's a fascist. He argued that Trump should be reinstated as president, even though Trump lost. Trump, a proto-fascist dictator. His niece. They're trying to destroy democracy. I won't go through this whole article, but it's very clear. This guy is not trustworthy. That by Vaush giving him this legitimacy, people who disagree with him might be like, well, maybe I'll sub to Tim Pool. Maybe I can hear what someone rational on the other side has to say. And then they'll get pumped full of fascist propaganda. Vaush really messed this one up.
Can I meet in the middle on that one, on that very last one?
Yeah.
I do not trust the pharmaceutical industries, though the available evidence does seem to point to the effectiveness of the vaccines. I say this, nationalize the pharma industry. Seriously. It could be used for the collective good, and I would unironically actually trust it more in the hands of our ineffective, bloated government than I would the sociopaths who run it currently. And
So
I mean that.
I'll wrap this up by saying, always talk to your doctor. This is one of the biggest things. Like YouTube is very strict on this, especially. But I genuinely think this is the right answer. If you're watching this, don't assume anyone here is right or wrong. I mean, I'm sure there are people who think Charlie's made a bunch of good points, and you have. Ultimately, it's down between you and your doctor. And I'll stress, for whatever your opinion, Charlie, I understand. Hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin haven't been approved by the FDA, and so that's just another.
We're just asking questions whether it works or not.
So that
Pfizer has. He literally said just asking questions. Oh my God. I'm just asking questions. I'm not vaccinated, but it's dangerous, maybe, but I'm just asking questions. Look at that freaking smirk.
That's why I think it's really important, because I think there are, I got to be honest, in regards to ivermectin, people have been eating horse paste that they sell. I looked up what the FDA says about it. They say do not do this, and they actually give a very good reason. They say, although people are claiming that, if an animal can take it, someone else can, that's not true. There's some things that dogs can't have that humans can. Right. So please talk to your doctor, and I definitely hope.
This has become more of a thing. They're selling out ivermectin in stores right now because people like this are filling people's minds with nonsense. Talk to your doctor. Since when have most people in this country had the access to just talk to their doctor whenever they want? Copays, wait times. Maybe your doctor's overworked and you just don't even trust them because they barely have time to see you.
We can continue having debates about this stuff, because that was vastly important. I'm really glad you guys were able to have the conversation.
I hadn't even heard of the horse paste thing. That's
Yes.
horrifying.
Ivermectin is technically a drug for horses. It's off-label use.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a dewormer. And so you can go to Tractor Supply, and they have a sign that says do not eat this, and please.
Any drug for horses will burn a human out from the inside. Those
Like
things
mine,
are, you've been to your, they're titans. They're like,
So let's talk about the other big topic, critical race theory. That's the one that I had a terrible answer, absolutely, when you asked me about it. And it was because I think my approach to it was too surface level.
Unvaccinated, 5 times more likely to get COVID. 29 times more likely to be hospitalized for their infection. This is after the Delta variant. August 24th to 27th. On to critical race theory.
Cultural. So the last time we had Vaush on, when you asked me about it, I couldn't give you a good answer. And I think we can talk about what's happening in schools, the things they're teaching children, and I don't know if either of you has an opinion and wants to start off with.
Floor is yours.
Yeah, so there are 2 CRTs. There's the critical race theory that I know of, which is a highly esoteric, essentially elective class that you can take in some law schools that teaches you a variety of incredibly eclectic legal theories that some of which I like and some of which I think I disagree with. And then there's the critical race theory that people like Christopher Rufo have been trying to push, a sort of catch-all term to describe all anti-racism. We see these anti-CRT bills being put through state legislators, and a lot of them don't even mention critical race theory. They mention stuff that's been boilerplate anti-racist theory for like 2 centuries. That stuff really concerns me. If I think that academia is to an extent sacred, of course, all the good things in our society now were born in the halls of academia. The Enlightenment, our democracy, the fair trial that we enjoy if we're arrested, these were things that were originally considered to be the crackpot initiatives of academics, and only through the respect of those ideas have we arrived at, well, what we have today. So if there are problems within academia, I would have them solved in academia, not through the big hand of government reaching in and censoring everyone who says something that disagrees with some political party.
So a point of clarification, you don't believe that critical race theory is in schools?
I think that maybe there are ideas which overlap with critical race theory, but there's always going to be overlap between academic ideas. I mean, I drank water, so did Hitler, one of those type situations.
I think you're coming at it from in good faith, where you're technically correct here that the super academic way of defining critical race theory is not being taught to 4th graders, right? With that
I
being
hope so. It'd be pretty
with
tough
that
for
being
them.
said, there are. It's almost like saying, we're not teaching advanced geometry to 4th graders, but we are teaching them, very basic math, right? We'll get them the Euclidean geometry. So the very basics of this are definitely in schools, and there's many examples of this, right? The National Education Association literally came out in their press release and said that they are going to push for, and their word was critical race theory, just so we're clear. They use that term, right? That's not Christopher Rufo, that's not James Lindsay, who are good friends of mine. That's the National Education Association, right? And I think they might even be talking about something different than the Delgado theory of critical race theory, right? And so what I want to try to do here, Tim, is we can talk about critical race theory as an academic theory, or we could use a filler term like wokeism, which is more like racial justice, which I actually think would probably be, we can call it racial justice and meet in the middle, right?
I really feel like there are probably 4-digit number of people in America who are studied on actual critical race theory, not including myself.
And
by the way.
I'm not even prepared to do that, but I'm happy to talk about racial justice education and wokeism, which I think
That's what the discourse is centered on.
Well, I think you guys actually agree in essence that the academic
That Vaush here doesn't fight back on the term wokeism as if that's like what's happening here is just so ridiculous. Critical race theory. Well, this is one of the worst Wikipedia pages I've ever seen in my entire life. It starts out okay. Critical race theory is a body of legal scholarship and an academic movement of U.S. civil rights scholars and activists who seek to critically examine the intersection of race and U.S. law and to challenge mainstream academic liberal approaches to racial justice. CRT examines social, cultural, and legal issues primarily as they relate to race and racism in the U.S. We're starting really good, but then, oh my God, this just gets... These all conflict with each other. It's all out of order. It's basically, if you look at this page, I'm not going to read any more of it. If you look at this page, it's a fierce battle between lefties and right-wingers, and they're like basically like getting like middles of sentences and halves of sentences, and it's utterly inscrutable. But this first part, basically, it's the idea that sometimes U.S. law, whether it's racist or not in its intention, can have racist consequences. Looking at what laws can have racist consequences. It's looking at whether just having a right that we give to everyone is actually going to lead to more equitable society if people start off with advantages that other people don't have, other demographics of people don't have. Now, I've heard Vaush say things like, this is an academic discipline, it's very esoteric, so we shouldn't even talk about it. That's just, to me, so the wrong approach, because it's like, even though there's string theory and general relativity, a physicist should be able to explain it to the layperson in a way they can understand. Just like you should be able to explain the vaccine, just like you should be able to explain this theory. Don't use Wikipedia in this case. The broad strokes here should be something we expect everyone to understand. And it's just elitism to think that people can't.
Critical race theory is, there's overlap with a component in schools, but what we often hear is someone will say critical race theory is being taught to my kids, and then someone will say cite one author of critical race theory that we've brought up in school, and the issue is we refer to it as I believe it's called critical race praxis. So this is something different than critical race theory. It's being implemented in education, but that's why you said wokeism. And you said,
I just think that discussion is so unhelpful when Joy Reid and Christopher Rufo are screaming at each other, and Joy Reid is saying like it's not being taught anywhere. Christopher Rufo, so yes it is. When in reality they're both right. They're just talking about two completely different things.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
No, I do. And Christopher Rufo has admitted this is like a kind of tactic. Critical race theory does sound spooky. I get a little shiver when I say it. Whereas stuff like anti-racist theory or structural racism maybe compel a little bit more thought when discussed on. It's kind of a moral panic that, in principle, I really disagree with. But if you want to talk, we can call it wokeism if you want. That's probably a more accurate term.
Yeah. I will just say, to the point about Christopher Rufo, white supremacist is also used as a catch-all term in the other direction.
If we're talking, I mean, in academia, the term white supremacist is virtually never used. It's sort of
Tim Pool.
a common parlance.
What I will say though about
when I say it. Whereas stuff like anti-racist theory or structural racism, it's kind of a moral panic that, in principle, I really disagree with. But if you want to talk, I mean, we can call it wokeism if you want. That's probably a more accurate term.
Yeah. I will just say, to the point about Christopher Rufo, white supremacist is also used as a catch-all term in the other direction.
You are a white supremacist.
If we're talking, I mean, in academia, the term white supremacist is virtually never used. It's sort of a common parlance.
What I will say, though, about to give credit to Christopher Rufo is that this is all kind of downstream from the conversation that Marcuse and Delgado started. It really is.
Well, let's talk about that. But just one thing, though, since we're operating under the blanket wokeism, which is a really broad term, let's talk about like specific ideas, because I'm sure there are some of them that I can provide a good defense for, and some of them I might
how about like
disagree with.
black-only dormitories?
Generally not a fan. I think that I don't think they're like explicitly harmful in the same way that traditional segregation is, but I also think that it incentivizes bad types of socialization, where the way that you get a reprieve from the faults of society is to find comfort in people of your own race. Maybe that incentivizes some bad stuff. In my university, we had safe spaces, but you know what?
How does this have anything to do with racial dynamics? It feels like black-only dormitories are kind of a lib thing. Critical race theory is often about discrediting lib ideas, like that affirmative action can really solve the fundamental issues. Of course, his first example has nothing to do with CRT.
What they were like chilled, like coffee break rooms behind like
Where'd
the
you go?
Latin. I went to Humboldt State.
Okay.
And right behind there, and like anyone could go in there, whatever. Just the only thing that they asked was that you not be like a dick. But as long as you met that qualification, that was fine. That to me, that's a good safe space. Maybe that works, you know?
So just had to go through more.
Go for it, please. No,
so
hit me.
I think this is actually really helpful. So how about reparations for slavery?
I think I'm pretty in favor of that, yeah.
Okay,
It's
make the argument.
just an owed debt. We said 40 acres and a mule. We never paid it. And unfortunately, the material reality for a lot of people who were slaves didn't change that much after they were emancipated. I mean, if you were a slave and you're made free, that's a big step up, don't get me wrong, but you have nothing. I mean, nothing. And because of the way generational wealth transfers from father to son or mother to either to anyone, to their children. Yeah, caught me there. Unfortunately, we still see the consequence of that borne out. You can actually look county by county. Where were slaves kept? Which were the plantations?
I mean, I think it might be hard to get to cash payments for black people. I mean, just in the sense, like, how do you define a black person? One way around this, I think, a reparations bill that just pumps a lot of money to the black community, into black communities, and does renovations of public housing and giving people better public spaces in black communities. I think that's one way we can at least do some small part to pay back the suffering that is caused by all these generational injustices.
Counties, and you see, oh, this group of black like neighborhoods, that's where they settled after slavery ended. It's like really immediate stuff, and it's a debt that this nation never paid.
I don't necessarily agree on reparations, but I think we need to clarify what that ultimately means. But I will say, I've long held the same position. I actually worked on a documentary. There's an issue of people who were enslaved, then they were released, and they were not given any means to actually develop and grow. And so there's a generational wealth gap between people based on race for these historical reasons. The challenge I see, I suppose, is, you know, we've done a lot to amend the laws and change them. For instance, you know, redlining and blockbusting have become illegal, and now we're dealing with an ultimately, I believe, is a class issue. Of course, racism still exists. But anyway, I digress on that point. What I wanted to get to is specifically on
A class issue, so maybe we can do some Marxian critical analysis to understand class dynamics. I mean, that's one thing that isn't talked about. There is a fundamentally Marxist background to critical race theory. It's critical theory, and critical theory comes from Marxist theory. And the thing is, Marx is used in sociology still. He's foundational to sociology. He's foundational in understanding class dynamics, and applying that sort of thinking to race is a great idea. And this idea that we have to just look at class and not be intersectional is just absurd. It's just not living in reality. It's promoting a worldview which is propagandistic towards fascist idealism.
reparations. What do you view reparations as, more importantly?
So this is a big divide. Some people think like cash payments. I'm not a big fan of that. It doesn't fix the problem, for one. It's if you can put money into that community, but there's been research done on how long a dollar stays in a black neighborhood as opposed to a white neighborhood. And if a black neighborhood, all of the businesses are owned by corporate boards that are all majority white, eventually the money filters out and you get a very temporary boost in living situation, not much long-term structural change. I'm a big fan of structural reparations, not based on race, but rather based on targeting neighborhoods that need it the most. Some of these neighborhoods are like white, and I passed through some of them on the way out from Ronald Reagan Airport. I can tell which parts of this country. You can see it in the
Okay, I should have just let Vaush make this argument, I guess.
bones of the neighborhood. And I think that a new proper reparations project, a new New Deal even, would go a long way. Get some
Well, so you're
workers
saying
out
not even
there.
based on race?
I think that we should recognize that this is largely a racial project because, unfortunately, poverty and race are really intertwined in this country. But in terms of applying it, I think that it would be much more healthy if we treated it like a collective effort to bring up the lowest sort of echelon of our economic.
So I want to ask you, Charlie, would you agree with a program that was how do I try this? Explained as reparations, but was not based on race, went to people based on class and neighborhood, so that it could help Latinos and white people and Asians and everybody?
First of all, I'm against reparations. I just don't like the word because it kind of implies this intergenerational type guilt or allowance that I kind of reject, and I'm happy to build that out further.
Guilt? Is he talking about the feeling of guilt? Is he talking about accountability, who is guilty or not guilty? Were our ancestors guilty? Yes. Are we benefiting from that? Yes. Should we feel the emotion of guilt? No.
Do I agree that the question is mostly class? Oh, absolutely. And I think that Vaush is hitting on something.
We should feel the emotion of righteousness to make the world a better place and actually, at this point, save the world from imminent destruction and fascism.
And I think that you're saying that it's inherently racial. I really want to explore that with you because I think that's interesting. I think you're wrong, but I think that's interesting where I think the racial thing is actually being used to distract people like you and I from actually talking about what's really happening here, which is a small group of people getting a lot richer while normal people get poor. And I think the racial thing is being used as this distraction tool to throw smokescreen in the middle while we're talking about something that we're never really going to have consensus on, when the true struggle right now is mainly economic.
Yeah, well, I think that applying reparations along racial lines runs into a bunch of really tough issues. Which neighborhoods? Do you go by like blood? Like, can you prove your great-great-grandfather was a slave? It gets very difficult very quickly. Maybe that would be the most direct interpretation of generational reparations. But in my mind, the reason why it's important to recognize the racial issue here is that the nature of class divides in this country is cut into racial policy prior to the Civil Rights Act. The redlining that took place, lines which still remain not in law but in practice, led to very distinct, I mean, sometimes, one side of the highway is nice and the other side of the highway, I mean, it legitimately
Can I
looks
just
like
jump in real quick?
Uh-huh.
I'm from Chicago. 47th Street was split by race. No joke. This is long-standing effects on the city. Just to point out.
No, and I grew up in LA, and on either side of the 5, which cut through the city, or the 405, sorry.
Let me
right
just
there.
interject something too, and I don't know if you're familiar. We were actually told that we would be arrested from the south side of 47th if we crossed 47th. We would get arrested because the cops would pull up and say, "You don't live in this neighborhood. What are you doing here?"
I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, so I've heard stories like that. I mean, it's very clear to say I'm not from Chicago.
I grew up in Beverly Hills, which is close, though, to West Hollywood and Koreatown, and the lines are clear as day. The reason I say that, though, about like the racial project,
Oh, we're all friends here. There isn't one person who wants a progressive utopia and then 2 people who want a fascist dystopia. No. We're all friends here. Ha, ha,
is
ha.
that because explicit discrimination is no longer in the law. We've pretty much wiped that out, with the exception of some, I guess, edge cases. The project of systemic racism, or the existence of systemic racism, is something which is carried through class by inertia. It isn't something you can explicitly legislate along anymore. I mean, obviously, nobody's out there passing laws like black people can't do this. That'd be silly. But instead, the consequences of slavery and of second-class citizenship for black people left unaddressed, a wound left to fester that, unfortunately, can't really heal itself inertially unless we do something specific.
So the issue with that argument is that the more that we intervened in the black community, it actually had the opposite effect. And Thomas Sowell probably has done the best research and literature on this. You can laugh all you want. He's got
I wasn't trying to besmirch.
He's a very thoughtful thinker, and he actually lived through this, right? He lived through the Black Renaissance in the 40s and the 50s, where redlining was a legitimate problem. So was yellowlining, by the way, against Italians and against Jews. Nowhere nearly as bad, but there were other degrees of discrimination based on ethnicity and cultural background. And the black community, especially, the area really well in the south of Chicago, right near the Chicago stockyards, the black community almost had this rallying cry where they were being discriminated against everywhere, and they kind of collectivized their purchasing power, and they saw their incomes increase actually at a higher rate than white Americans in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. You've heard this argument many times, and you probably disagree with it, but it's just true, is that the moment that we all of a sudden de-emphasized fathers being in the home and subsidized fatherlessness,
Blacks do better with their own kind, and their fathers are just irresponsible.
Saw all these other trends increase. So right before the Civil Rights Act passed, about 24% of black children were born without a father. Now it's upwards of 70%. You guys can look at the Washington Examiner. It's 77%. Let's say it's 65%. So something has to explain that 40-point increase.
May I?
Yeah, just let me finish.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that America got more racist. It could be the cocaine thing, which, is a common issue. It could be, operations of all these things. But a 40-point increase, I would point to a culture of fatherlessness really bad government-run public schools and then subsidizing behavior that isn't good.
So there are a few things that I can agree with you on. First of all, having
Badly run, he says, maybe underfunded a bit because of property taxes being tied to school budgets. Maybe if part of reparations included funding predominantly black schools really well. That's, of course, in Charlie's view, going to hurt black people because of reasons.
2 people in your house to raise you is pretty much essential. You absolutely
Glad
need
we
to.
agree.
This is undeniable. While I don't believe in shaming single parents, even if their single parentedness is a
I agree
product
with
of
that.
bad decision making, it's still good. You need it's in this economy, one parent, honestly.
Yeah.
But with that being said, there has been
But what about 3 parents, Vaush?
research shown that the rate of black fatherlessness is somewhat over-exaggerated, in large part because that number only applies to married fathers, so husbands raising their children. It turns out when you account for unmarried black couples taking care of their kids, the numbers actually rise to those I think just below white couples. I think there was an article on that. I don't know if I remember saw it in Vice, but it tracks back to some really big study that was done back in 2016. So that's one point. But you are right. There are perverse incentives. For example, many welfare stipulations cut off with a shared income, which is only a few $1,000s per year higher than the necessary cutoff for the single income. Meaning that if you're a single mom, you can apply for the welfare just fine. But then if you get married or otherwise file jointly, you go above the cap for welfare. This is a horribly designed program, undeniably, and it incentivizes bad, destructive behavior. The best thing that we can do, we restructure the welfare system in this country. Welfare is good for us. It is. I don't benefit from it. No, I don't think either of you benefit from it, I'm guessing. But we do collectively downstream from the increased economic potential of people who now have the money to afford daycare, proper childcare, get an education. In the
And also just not being surrounded by miserable people whenever you go outside.
long run, people in this country being richer enriches all of us. It's a mutual project. So we work on that. We find out what works and what doesn't, which welfare programs function, which don't, which types of economic revitalization function and which don't. And I legitimately believe that if we applied this country has the bones to be just a permanent economic beacon on the hill, just like a shining example to the rest of the world.
I agree with a lot of that. The bigger issue with the racial thing is that when you put some of these factors in, even to present data, it doesn't pan out on racial lines, right? And this is where I think you'll agree, because you just said 2 parents in the home is a good thing, which we totally agree on. I think that's the ideal. Everything shows that that is something that we should, push for.
3 parents maybe, getting even better.
Oh yeah,
50%.
yeah, polyamorous relationships.
Yeah.
Not a fan.
Thanks.
But I will say that if you look at the data from the government, that a white child being raised by a single mother is less likely to succeed by 10 independently picked metrics than a black child being raised by a mother and a father. And so maybe it's less about the skin color and more about the removal of parents and specifically fathers in the homes. Now, if you want to talk about a domestic Marshall Plan to go put fathers back in the home regardless of skin color, I will sign up for that in a second.
With the right welfare, the right systems, I think people will tend to their own families.
But that would then all of a sudden de-emphasize what you said earlier, where it says it needs to be on racial lines, right? I say, no, it needs to be on nuclear family lines.
Well, no, I think that the neighborhood revitalization should just be on like a sort of class assessment. I think that when we recognize this problem, though, there are so many trends when it comes to poverty that involve the discussion of race, and there are some which do not. There are some types of poverty, some effects that are just ubiquitous and equally felt. But with regards to, say, black people, the fact that they couldn't get loans to purchase homes for a very long time. I mean, there were people living who couldn't do this. The fact that they didn't benefit from the Marshall Plan, if I remember correctly, after World War II.
Well, Marshall Plan was Europe. You're talking about the GI Bill.
Oh, sorry, the GI Bill. My apologies.
Let me just point out all these white guys sitting having a debate over the black community, huh?
I just think
kidding.
that there is a lot of economic inequality. A lot of it's tied to race, but we don't need to turn this into some weird blood quantum issue where we go tracking down every black American and holding them under a microscope to see whether they get benefits.
Now,
we just need to tend to our own.
This is where we kind of got off critical race theory very quickly.
I forgot about that.
I want to bring it back.
We're
because-
agreeing way too much, Tim.
All right.
No, because this is one of the issues I see, right? You see these conversations around.
We're agreeing way too much. Charlie Kirk loves how well this is going for him. And Vaush just seems to be oblivious to how he's helping these horrible people do horrible things. Say horrible things.
I don't know how you describe it because it's a variety of things. Wokeism is typically a catch-all term for some kind of ideology that involves anti-racism, which involves critical race theory, critical race praxis. And you're seeing in schools specific curriculums where they say to kids like, we had a book here. We had a book brought to us by one of these parents who's been going to these schools. And it was an anti-racist curriculum workbook where it asked children why they thought that black children felt bad about their skin color. Now, I take issue with those things. They had another book where it was a little girl yelling at her mother saying, "You're lying to me about race." And then there was a whiteness contract with a devil tail coming out of it.
Okay, I saw that one.
Yeah, these are in schools.
Yeah, okay, so that the whiteness devil tail thing, I saw that. That's indefensible. I'm not going to stand at that. With regards to that, what was it? Why do you think black folk feel bad about their skin?
And I'll be careful because I don't have the book in front of me. It was something to this effect. It was a bunch of questions where it would ask you things like that and then ask you to answer. You know, what have you done to make someone based on their skin color behave or whatever, and things of that nature?
I think these are conversations that are worth having. I wonder, with regards to...
I don't remember exactly what I read, but I'm going to give you the most offensive and illogical thing I can think of that might vaguely have something to do with what I read, because that's how I work.
To what you're saying, do you know what grade level these were at?
I think she mentioned the woman. It was Azra.
Yeah, Azra.
I think 4th grade.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
But I got to be honest, like the anti-racist one didn't have any pictures or anything. It was just questions. And I think she mentioned it was in a 3rd grade. The what was it called? What was the book called about the whiteness contract? The one you said was indefensible. That one was like a little girl who looked to be about like 8 years old. So
Yeah, I saw that online.
Can I ask a question? So let's go to just piece,
Yeah, sure.
issue by issue. Ibram X. Kendi, who's kind of one of the,
The heck's a whiteness contract? Fox News, Daily Mail, thousands and thousands of things being written to fight racism, and then they find the one thing, and of course they gotta focus on it. The Atlantic, okay, interesting. Atlantic isn't too bad. See if it shows it. I like the artwork. Contract binding you to whiteness. You get stolen land, stolen riches, special favors. True. Whiteness gets you to mess endlessly with the lives of your friends, neighbors, loved ones, and all fellow humans of color for the purposes of profit. How is that a get to? It sounds like something I wouldn't want to do. I guess if you're a horrible person, yeah, you could use that. Use your whiteness. It's kind of weird. Your soul sign below. Lands, riches, and favors may be revoked at any time for any reason. This isn't a white person devil. This is a money devil. Jesus Christ.
archangels of the wokeism movement.
Beloved figure in the minds of conservatives and liberals alike.
So Ibram X. Kendi, and I'm paraphrasing, and you guys could pick up the quote, is that we need discrimination today because there was discrimination yesterday. That's the essence of the quote, right, Tim?
Yeah, he said the only solution for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only solution for present discrimination is future discrimination.
So I find that to be reprehensible. What say you?
I think it's misguided in large part because I don't believe if there was some God who could just distribute all resources in a perfectly ordained way and did so.
I believe his argument was mischaracterized. What are these
The snap
people
of a finger, then
talking
maybe that
about?
would be a decent argument. In the real world, we have to go through politics, and any kind of discriminatory treatment under any circumstances, no matter how well-intentioned, is going to have adverse effects. So, with regard to what he said, there is a very charitable interpretation, and that charitable interpretation is discriminatory practices in the past necessitate favorable practices today, a way of bringing people up. My reparations argument, I mean, the poor in this country have always had it bad, at least worse than they could otherwise. That is essentially a version of that argument. Preferable treatment towards the poor. We do this with welfare because there are systemic barriers keeping them from full participation. Along racial lines, I don't even know what that would look like. I don't even know how that would look good. I'm not a big fan of
He
affirmative
wrote an
action.
amendment, right, called the Anti-Racist Amendment to the Constitution. It's not being considered anytime soon, where it would be preference.
You'll see, Biden will get it.
Yeah, based on skin color, that there would be some sort of accommodation based just by the melanin content in your skin.
There is one thing I want to say, though, and this is common in upper academia, and I know Ibram sometimes gets brought into non-academic discussions, which I don't consider myself an academic, so I'm including myself in that. But sometimes I think these are fun to discuss, these ideas. What I noticed, at least in some of the classes that I took, the higher end classes, was that sometimes when you were presented ideas, they were presented not to have you agree with them, but rather to incentivize the greatest discussion. For example, I wasn't an economist, but I did learn about Karl Marx. Now, not many professors are actual Marxists, unfortunately. So when Marx was brought up in that context, it wasn't like, here's what you need to know, here's what you should believe. It was more, here are some ideas, radical and agreeable. What do you think about them? And when I look at what Kendi has written, I don't often agree with some of the more radical propositions, but I do enjoy the process. And I don't think that's something which should warrant the state intervening to cut out those discussions. I think that's a
great
brutish response.
That's a great segue, if I could go. So the next question then is, should we be teaching first and second and third graders to be hyper conscious, aware of race all the time? I think that's destructive. I think it goes against the American promise of e pluribus unum, of caring more about character than skin color. And yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was a mixed bag when it came to this stuff.
He's a cool guy.
But
he's not against just hyper-conscious of race. He seems to be against any consciousness of racism whatsoever. One of the biggest privileges of being white is you never really have to think about your skin color because you aren't really judged for it by anyone. If you're black, you think, I better bathe every day, otherwise they'll think I'm stinky because I'm black. They think I have to dress really nice, otherwise they'll think I'm slovenly because I'm black. It's part of their day-to-day experience. I think it's only fair that we spend a little time at least teaching white people, especially when they're just learning how the world works, teaching white people to have some empathy for the experience of people with different skin colors is a good idea.
He was a very radical socialist in some regard, but he really hit it perfectly when he said that this was the ideal of the American system. Do you see any downsides to getting 3-year-olds just caring, not 3-year-olds, third graders caring about the color of people's skin all the time?
Well, I think depending on their environment, they might already, whether they know it or not, in very implicit and subtle ways. We know from tests done, for example, on like little kids, like 4-year-olds or whatever, that some elements of implicit racial bias already infect their thinking. Now, that isn't a moral judgment. We're all flawed beings. We live and we die. We all have biases. That is just a part of life. But I think conversations about those things can be valuable. I don't believe we live in a colorblind world, so teaching people that we do can often lead them to remain ignorant to evident problems. Now, to what extent would you be comfortable, what would you say, like bringing a racial consciousness to third graders?
For me, very little to none. As don't care about it, de-emphasize it, look at the spirit, the soul, the conduct, and the character of the human being. Their skin color means nothing. Not saying that you should start to emphasize, organize what people look like, because therefore it means something that we're going to tell you. A great example is that this is the textbook definition of stereotyping, right? Is that if you see a black person, you don't know their history. You don't know if they're the son of a Nigerian billionaire. You don't know if they're an immigrant from Turks and Caicos. And you don't know if they're the 9th generation descendant of slaves, right? There's been 2 million blacks that have come to America legally through the immigration process since 1980. So this sort of hyper fixation on race, and I want to keep on getting back to this because I'm just curious, is do you think this is actually helpful when there actually might be stuff that 90% of the country agrees on? Do you think this actually might be a smokescreen tactic?
Well, it really depends on what's being taught. So here are some things I obviously don't want taught. One group is better than another, of course, you know.
Vaush, you should say no. Unequivocally no.
Black people are like this, white people are like this.
That is being taught in some schools.
There are some schools that do that, and while I would look to see their curriculum mended, I just don't want to implicitly agree with like a state ban. I would see adjustments done. But there are some things that I think could be done well. For example, say you're teaching about very basic early history, you know?
This is where I wanted to get to.
Yeah, okay.
This is important.
So here are some things about America's founding that I like. One of the first practical liberal democracies, glory of the republic. Folks had nice hair back then.
Not a democracy, but a republic.
Right,
That's
well,
okay.
I mean, you know, they're not mutually exclusive. And we, of course, did more to fulfill the promise of a democracy with time. But obviously, when America was founded, it was a slave.
That's the ultimate conservative debate bro line. It's a republic, not a democracy. Oh God, I heard that when I did debate in high school.
State. 1 in every 6
Lots.
people in America at that time was human property.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
How many states abolished slavery by the time the Constitution is ratified?
Well, I don't know the exact number.
9 out of
But
13. That's not a slave country.
Well, then you could say it was a confederacy with portions that were slave
I think
states.
that's better said. 9 out of 13 had already abolished. There was a sunset moratorium for slavery in the Constitution.
So this could...
Vermont abolished slavery in 1777. We were on the way to eradication. We were not a slave country.
Well, hold on. I mean,
And I'll add one thing.
we were on the way, but then like 80 years later, it was still happening.
So the question is why, right? That's a really important question. And
Economics, I
well,
imagine.
yeah, so Cotton Gin and John C. Calhoun. Happy to go through that. But yeah,
There was actually a grievance in the Declaration of Independence, specifically that the Crown had enslaved people.
the first draft.
Yeah, in the first
3/5 clause. For voting purposes, black people were considered 3/5 a person. And we don't have any slavery baked into our Constitution, Jesus.
draft from Thomas Jefferson. The Crown had enslaved people who had done nothing to offend the Crown, brought them to the States, and then were then offering them the freedom that was stolen from them to wage war against the colonists who had grievances.
It's an effective strategy. The
It
Union
is,
did it
but
too.
he-
They promised the slaves
Right.
when they moved southward. Yeah.
Jefferson took that out. And he did it because they felt, and this is according to historians, that without, I think it was South Carolina and Georgia, they would not have been able to win the Revolutionary War. And so they had to remove that,
That's exactly
hoping
right.
they would stay in. Now, the reality is, I'll just say one more point. They thought they were going to lose anyway. They really did. They didn't think they could go up against the greatest empire in the world at the time. So it's kind of unfortunate, I think. An important factor here is that I believe it was the British Empire, actually 1833 had abolished slavery in all of its territories, and it took the U.S. a little bit longer to do so. But I want to make sure I stress, this issue for the start of the country was contentious and ultimately led to violence because from the beginning, as Charlie pointed out, most of the states had already abolished this. So it was like people were ready to fight from the beginning.
I just want to say to that, my understanding of the founding of America isn't as simplistic as the founding fathers were evil because X or Y. I recognize, of course, that
And I appreciate that.
there are incredible complexities to those issues. And also, I'm not a historian. There are probably tons of things out there I don't even know that might change my opinion in the future. But with that being said, while I recognize there were fine-bodied, hearted, and souled Americans who recognized slavery was a moral aberration from the get-go, 1 in every 6 Americans was owned. And while that may have been concerning to some of the states, it was still ultimately under the purview of the federal government to make decisions with regards to the legality and constitutionality of that. Now, some people, they get really defensive when this conversation comes. I'm not saying you guys, but some people, they do. And I think it's because they think I'm assigning some kind of moral worth to them now, or to the country now, or making some kind of broad prescriptive statement. I'm not. The only thing I'm saying is, when you're teaching history to a bunch of kids, you have to teach it all. At least you have to teach the basic pointers. And for Black Americans, the history of this country has been less than favorable. So I think that in the context of that discussion, saying, and to this day, we still have some problems with race. There are some legacies of slavery that still affect Black people, and we're working on it today. Something like that. That's a kind of racialization that I'm in favor of, because it doesn't encourage
Also, having an empathy for what people with darker skin go through. Charlie Kirk wants us to have a sense of oneness, yet he doesn't want us to understand what a lot of people go through. He wants us to ignore it. So how is that uniting?
stereotyping. It doesn't encourage discrimination. It just encourages a base awareness of some serious problems.
So, but that's not happening, right? Is that largely what we're seeing through school districts like Chicago and in Washington, D.C., and the entire California school system, representing 10,000 schools and 6 million students.
I've seen the documents on those.
Yeah, is that it doesn't have that kind of nuance and complexity that you just presented, right? Where let me just say this, is that part of the kind of archangel triumphant of the wokeism coalition is Nicole Hannah-Jones, Robin DiAngelo, and Ibram X. Kendi. And Nicole Hannah-Jones in particular, right, the author of the 1619 Project, she heretically says that America was founded on slavery, right? And so
I'd be okay with that.
But it's just not true.
It depends on what you mean by founded on.
She defines this. She says the founding fathers were in favor of it. Not true. George Washington wasn't. John Adams wasn't. John Quincy Adams wasn't. Thomas Jefferson.
George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had slaves.
Even signed a moratorium on new slaves coming into the United States. Ben Franklin chaired an anti-slavery convention in 1775. None of these guys were writing expositionally how wonderful slavery was.
Well, this isn't being taught to third graders, right? The 1619 Project's a little New York op-ed.
No, it's not. See, that's where you're wrong. The 1619 Project's being implemented as school district curriculum in thousands of school districts across the country.
That's true.
Well,
It's not just like a podcast. This is curriculum.
Right, there are principles of the 1619 Project that I think are defensible. First of all, we as Americans tend to think of the founding of our country as its legal founding, you know? But the legal founding of the United States didn't really mean much for a slave. I mean, it really didn't matter that much for the peasantry of the time, no matter what.
See, that's where I disagree. So when was the first state to abolish slavery? Vermont in 1777. Why?
Well, I mean, for the
because they
slaves
were
who lived
inspired
in-
by the Declaration of Independence. Things started to change in that year.
Right, but the slaves that then continued to be slaves would have been in the states that didn't make that choice, right?
Which
I mean,
were
they would have
largely
been-
in southern states.
So, well, that's what I mean. I didn't mean to miss out on the particulars there. The only point that I'm making is that depending on whose lineage you follow,
It's definitely easier to free all the slaves when your whole economy isn't built on slavery.
depending on the narrative that you tell, this is a very postmodern idea. And I would like to consider myself charitable to postmodernism, the idea that there are many ways you can describe the human experience, which I think we all believe to some extent. Depending on who you follow, you get very different ideas on what America is, when America was founded, not in a legal sense, but in a conceptual sense, and who today holds the birthrights to which they were entitled. And these conversations should be had. They're worthwhile conversations to have. I've seen some of the curriculums in these schools. I find some of them a little bit objectionable. But to be perfectly clear, I found school curriculums objectionable for ages. About half of Americans believe in the lost cause myth, the idea that the North started the a civil war and it was over like states' rights or whatever. That's believed by a large number of Americans. There are textbooks put out by Pearson in Texas that have
There is
narratives
some
in them
truth
that
to
are-
that, by the way,
There's-
just so we're clear.
I'm
happy to go through Civil War history.
Well, let me-
on
let
that, but
I just want to say, I have
There is some truth to that, by the way. But no, Charlie Kirk is not a white supremacist. He says a lot of things white supremacists say, but he's not a white supremacist. He's not a fascist either. He just supports fascist ideology and also action. I think that's enough for now. So I think what I'm going to do is end the video at an hour and then come back tomorrow and finish it. It's been several days since I posted my last video. Well, I posted it first and it was an hour and 20 minutes long. Then I realized after 9 people had watched it that it was way too choppy. So I edited it down, made it less than an hour. It's very slick now. If you want to check it out, it's on Afghanistan. And I thought this video might take 2 parts. So we're going to do that because there's a lot to get into here in the second half. And I don't want to give it some disservice. After the second half, I think I'm going to do a video on voter rights and campaign finance reform and how our democracy is very quietly on the verge of ending. But I will finish this debate in the next video. There's been a lot of technical issues that I faced to get this stream going. I think we're finally in the swing of things, and I'm just going to start pumping out videos, at least until school starts. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you come back for the second part, and I hope this was not too dry and informative. Thank you.